The words cut through the kitchen like a blade sharper than any Ruth Brennan had ever known. You ain't worth nothing, girl. Never was. Never will be. Mrs. Henley stood in the doorway of the St. Louis boarding house, arms crossed, eyes cold as the November frost creeping across the windows. Ruth's hands trembled as she clutched the crumpled telegram, her last hope reduced to a piece of paper so worn it might tear if she gripped it any tighter. $12 a month to care for 5 motherless children. Red River Crossing, Texas. A place she'd never heard of, offering a life she'd never imagined. But it was all she had left. $23 remained to her name. $23, and a future that stretched no further than 10 days, when this boarding house would close its doors forever and leave her with nowhere to go. The telegram had been hidden behind a loose board in this very kitchen, discarded by someone who deemed it beneath consideration. Ruth had found it by accident while scrubbing floors, and in that moment, Providence had smiled on her in a way it never had before. She was 28 years old, plain-faced, people said, too tall, too broad, too much of everything that didn't matter, and not enough of everything that did. She'd heard it from her fiancé 3 days before their wedding. She'd heard it from the Kansas farmer who'd taken one look at his mail-order bride and laughed until he cried. She'd heard it in 1,000 small ways from 1,000 small people who couldn't see past the surface of things. But children didn't care about surfaces. That night, Ruth sat at the small desk in her cramped room and wrote by candlelight. Her hand moved across the paper with a steadiness that surprised her, given how her heart hammered against her ribs. Dear Mr. McCord, I must be honest with you, sir. I am plain in appearance and large in figure. I have been told many times that I am not fit for any man. But I can love your children. I can care for them, feed them, keep them safe. If you will have me, I will come. Respectfully, Ruth Brennan. She sealed the letter before doubt could creep in. At dawn, she posted it with her last stamp and purchased a one-way train ticket with 19 of her remaining $23. The ticket agent looked at her with something between pity and contempt, but Ruth held her head high as she walked out of that office. She had made her choice. She would live with it or die trying. The train journey lasted 4 days. Missouri gave way to Kansas. Kansas melted into the Oklahoma Territory. Then Texas rose up to meet her, all red dust and endless sky, a land so vast it seemed to swallow hope and possibility in equal measure. Ruth sat in the third-class car with her single, worn carpetbag on her lap, watching America scroll past the frost-covered windows. She did not eat. She could not afford to. Her stomach cramped with hunger. But Ruth had been hungry before. She knew how to endure. On the 3rd day, a Mexican woman across the aisle offered her tortillas wrapped in cloth. The kindness was so unexpected that Ruth nearly wept. The woman's eyes held understanding, the kind that comes from knowing what it means to be judged, to be found wanting, to keep going anyway. Texas es duro, señora, the woman said softly. Hard land for hard people. Ruth nodded. She would have to be hard, harder than she'd ever been. When the train finally pulled into Red River Crossing on a Thursday afternoon in late November, the cold hit her like a fist. Not the wet cold of Missouri, but a dry, cutting wind that stung her face and froze her breath in the air. The platform was nearly empty, a few men unloading cargo, a woman hurrying toward a waiting wagon, and at the far end, a tall figure in a worn cowboy hat beside a buckboard, 5 small shapes huddled in the wagon bed behind him. Children. her children, if he would have her. Ruth's legs felt unsteady as she walked toward them, her boots crunching through the thin layer of snow. The man looked up as she approached. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and grief. Dark hair showed silver at the temples beneath his hat. His eyes were gray as a winter sky, and they studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not disgust, not disappointment, just a bone-deep weariness that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a dying fire. "Mr. McCord?" He looked at her, really looked, took in her height, her plain face, her inadequate coat, her single worn bag. His expression didn't change, didn't show the cruel amusement she'd learned to expect. He simply stood there, a man who'd seen too much and lost too much, and was too tired to pretend anymore. "You're the woman who wrote the letter." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Ruth Brennan." Behind him, a thin cry pierced the air. A baby, weak and raspy, the sound of a child in distress. Ruth's professional instincts, honed from years of caring for her younger siblings, kicked in immediately. She didn't wait for permission. She walked to the wagon and climbed up into the bed, her skirts dragging through the snow. The children shrank back from her. All except one. A girl of about 10, with hair the color of summer wheat, held a bundle in her arms, rocking desperately. Her face was pale with exhaustion and fear. "Please, miss," the girl whispered. "Please. She won't stop crying. I don't know what to do." Ruth held out her arms. "May I?" The girl hesitated, looked at her father. The man nodded once. Carefully, gently, the girl transferred the bundle into Ruth's arms. The baby was tiny, perhaps 9 months old, wrapped in blankets that weren't thick enough for the cold. Her face was flushed with fever, her cries weak and raspy. Ruth pressed her lips to the infant's forehead. "Too hot, much too hot." "How long has she been this warm?" "Since yesterday morning," the girl said. "Papa tried to get the doctor, but he's 2 hours away, and the fever just got worse." Ruth was already unbuttoning her coat. She tucked the baby against her chest, against the warmth of her own body. "What's her name?" "Hannah." "Hannah." Ruth stroked the baby's cheek with one finger. "That's a beautiful name." "Hello, Hannah. I'm Ruth. I'm going to take care of you now." The crying quieted, not stopped, but softened. Hannah turned her face into Ruth's chest, seeking warmth, seeking comfort, seeking something she hadn't had enough of in too long. Ruth looked up at the man still standing beside the wagon. "We need to get her inside. She needs warmth, and she needs to drink. Do you have milk at the ranch?" "Got a milk cow." "Good. We need to go now, Mr. McCord." Something shifted in his gray eyes. Surprise, maybe, at being told what to do. But he didn't argue. He turned to a boy of about 12, standing near the horses. "Wyatt, help Miss Brennan into the front seat." The boy moved quickly, taking Ruth's elbow and helping her down from the wagon bed, then up onto the buckboard seat. The man climbed up beside her, took the reins. "It's 2 hours to the ranch," he said. "Roads are rough." "Then let's not waste time." He snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, and Ruth held Hannah close against her chest, humming softly, an old hymn her mother used to sing. Behind them in the wagon bed, the other children watched with wary eyes. The girl who'd been holding Hannah sat closest, hope and suspicion warring on her young face. "You came from the train," the girl said. Not a question, an observation. "Yes." "Where from?" "St. Louis. Before that, Pennsylvania. That's far. It is. The girl was quiet for a moment. Then, the others didn't come from so far away. Ruth looked at her. The others? The women Papa hired. The girl's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. The voice of a child who'd learned not to expect much. 6 of them since Mama died. None of them stayed. Why not? Too hard, too cold, too many children. The girl shrugged. They said we were too much trouble. Ruth's heart cracked. These children. These brave, wounded children. You're not trouble, she said quietly. That's what they all said at first. The accusation hung in the air. Ruth couldn't argue with it. She couldn't promise she'd be different. Couldn't swear she'd stay when 6 others had already left. Words were cheap. These children knew that better than anyone. So she didn't make promises she might not be able to keep. She simply held Hannah closer and kept humming, that old hymn threading through the cold air like a prayer. The ranch appeared through the fading light like something from another world. A 2-story house, solid but showing signs of neglect. Shutters hung loose. The porch steps sagged. But the bones were good. Ruth could see that even from a distance. This had been a home once. With care, it could be again. Wyatt, take the horses to the barn, Garrett said as he pulled the wagon to a stop. He turned to Ruth. Miss Brennan, give me the baby. Ruth hesitated. She didn't want to let go of Hannah. Not yet. Not until she was sure the fever was truly breaking. But the man was already reaching for his daughter, and his hands were careful despite their size, gentle despite the calluses. I got her, he said quietly. Get yourself inside. You're half frozen. He was right. Ruth's fingers were numb, her face stinging with cold. She climbed down from the wagon, stumbling on legs that had gone stiff from the long ride. The man caught her elbow, steadied her. Careful. Thank you. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. 2 people at the end of their rope, holding on however they could. Then the man turned and carried Hannah toward the house, and Ruth followed. The interior confirmed what the exterior had suggested. This was a house in crisis. Dishes stacked in the dry sink, laundry piled in corners, dust on every surface, a fire dying in the hearth, barely giving off heat. But beneath the chaos, Ruth saw the potential. Good furniture, solid construction, a home that had once been loved and could be loved again. Kitchen's through there, the man said, nodding toward a doorway. Stove should still be warm. There's milk in the cold box on the porch. Ruth was already moving. She shed her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. First, the fire. She built it up with practiced efficiency until flames roared with proper heat. Then the stove. She stoked it, added wood, set water to boil. The girl who'd been holding Hannah appeared with milk and clean rags. What's your name? Ruth asked. Belle. Belle, that's lovely. Can you show me where to find more blankets? Belle ran off and returned with an armful. Ruth worked quickly, heating the milk to body temperature, testing it against her wrist the way she'd learned when raising her youngest sister. When it was ready, she took Hannah from the man's arms and settled into the chair by the fire. The baby whimpered. Ruth pressed a cloth soaked in warm water to her forehead, checking her temperature. Still too high, but not as dangerous as before. She coaxed drops of milk between Hannah's lips, patient and persistent. The baby fought at first, too exhausted and uncomfortable to cooperate. But Ruth was patient. She'd done this before. She knew how to wait. An hour passed, then another. The other children gathered around, watching silently. The 12-year-old boy stood by the door, arms crossed, pretending he didn't care. Belle hovered at Ruth's elbow, ready to help with whatever was needed. A younger boy, perhaps 7, sat on the floor near Ruth's feet, his eyes fixed on his baby sister. He hadn't spoken a word. And there was another boy, smaller still, maybe 5, who crept into the room like a mouse and pressed himself against the wall. The man stood in the shadows, watching it all. At midnight, the fever broke. Hannah's breathing eased. Her skin cooled. She opened her eyes, blue eyes like her mother must have had, and looked up at Ruth. Then she smiled. A tiny, perfect smile that cracked the world open. "There you are," Ruth whispered. "There's my girl." Hannah's small hand reached up and grabbed Ruth's finger, held tight. And Ruth started to cry. She couldn't help it. All the years of rejection, of being told she was too much, not enough, unfit for any man, all of it faded in the grip of that tiny hand. This child didn't care what Ruth looked like, didn't care about her size or her plain face or her history of failure. This child just wanted to be warm and fed and loved. And Ruth could give her that. Ruth could give her everything. "Miss Brennan." The man's voice made her jump. She hadn't heard him approach. He was standing beside her chair, close enough that she could smell hay and leather and the clean sweat of honest work. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm crying." "You saved her." Ruth shook her head, wiping her face quickly. "Her fever broke, that's all. Children get sick. They get better." "Not always." His voice was rough, full of something raw and painful. Ruth looked up at him, at the grief carved into his weathered face, old grief and fresh grief layered together like sediment. "My wife," he said, "Hannah's mother. She got sick too, after Hannah was born. Fever took hold and wouldn't let go." Ruth's heart squeezed. "I'm so sorry." "Caroline, that was her name." He said it like he hadn't spoken it in months, like the word had to fight its way out of his throat. "She died in March, 8 months ago. And you've been alone since then, with 5 children. Tried to hire help, but they don't stay." He laughed, bitter and broken. "Can't blame them. It's hard work, thankless, cold as hell and twice as lonely." Ruth looked down at Hannah, still gripping her finger, sleeping peacefully now. "I'll stay." The man went still. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." "You don't know us, don't know what you're getting into. I know that baby needs someone to hold her through the night. I know those children in the other room haven't had a proper meal in days. I know you're so tired you can barely stand." Ruth's voice was steady. "And I know I have nowhere else to go. Right now, tonight, this is where I need to be." The man stared at her for a long moment. Then he sat down in the chair across from her. Not close. There was still distance between them, careful and proper, but closer than he'd been before. "Sam will fight you," he said quietly. "He's angry. Blames me for his mother's death. Won't let anyone in. He's 12. He's allowed to be angry. Belle's taken on too much. She tries to mother the others, but she's just a child herself. Then I'll let her be a child again. Lucas won't speak or cry, not since Caroline died. It ain't natural, a 7-year-old who won't cry. He will when he's ready. And Caleb's scared of everything, the dark, the cold, being left." Ruth met his eyes. "Then I won't leave." He leaned forward, studying her face in the firelight. Looking for lies, maybe, or the same empty promises all the others had made. Ruth let him look. She had nothing to hide. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you come all this way? Give up everything for a family you never met. Ruth looked down at Hannah, at the small, perfect weight of her in her arms. Because once, a long time ago, I had a family too. 4 younger siblings who needed me, and I swore I'd take care of them no matter what. Her voice caught. But I couldn't. They grew up, moved on, found lives of their own, and I was left with nothing. No family, no home, no purpose. She looked up at him. I'm not fit for any man, I know that, but I can love your children. I can care for them. I can give them everything I never got to give my own. The fire crackled in the hearth. Hannah sighed in her sleep. Outside, the wind howled against the windows. And in that moment, something shifted. Something fundamental and irreversible. The man stood slowly. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkness. The last woman who came here stayed 3 days. Said the children were too wild, too needy, too much work. He turned to face Ruth. She said I was a broken man running a broken ranch, and no amount of money was worth putting up with all of us. Ruth's grip tightened on Hannah. She was wrong. Was she? This isn't a broken ranch, Mr. McCord. It's a grieving one. There's a difference. Something flickered in his gray eyes. Pain, hope, fear of both. You can call me Garrett, he said quietly. Ruth. There's a room off the kitchen, Ruth. It's small, but it's warm. Has a lock on the inside. Thank you. He moved toward the door, then stopped, looked back at her, at this plain woman holding his baby daughter like she was the most precious thing in the world. I can't promise this will work. Can't promise those children will let you in. Can't promise I'll be easy to work with. I'm not asking for promises, Garrett. I'm asking for a chance. Just a chance to prove I can be what you need. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once. You'll have it. He walked out, his footsteps echoing up the stairs, then fading to silence. Ruth sat alone by the fire, holding a sleeping baby, surrounded by a house full of strangers who might become family. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, something new was beginning. She had made it. Against all odds, with nothing but $19 and desperate courage, she had made it to Texas, to this ranch, to these children. Whether she could stay was another question entirely. But for tonight, for this one perfect night, Ruth Brennan had a place to be, and sometimes that was enough. The November sun hung low over the Texas panhandle, painting the red dirt gold. Ruth Brennan stood at the kitchen window of the McCord Ranch, watching Garrett work a young horse in the corral. 3 weeks had passed since that first desperate night when she'd arrived with nothing but $19 and a wrinkled telegram. 3 weeks since she'd held baby Hannah through that terrible fever, feeling the small body burn against her chest while Belle cried and Garrett paced like a caged animal. She'd stayed. That was the miracle none of them could quite believe yet. The house smelled different now. Bread baking, coffee percolating, wood smoke and soap instead of dust and despair. Ruth had scrubbed floors until her knees ached. She'd washed mountains of laundry in the creek behind the house, her hands raw from lye soap and cold water. She'd cooked 3 meals a day for 7 people, learning the temperamental wood stove that required coaxing like a stubborn mule. But it was more than cleaning, more than cooking. Lucas had spoken. That moment 2 days ago when he'd finally broken his 8 months of silence, tears streaming down his face as he clutched his mother's locket, telling them all how much he missed her, how scared he was that if he started crying, he'd never stop. Ruth had held both boys afterward, Wyatt and Lucas tangled together on the kitchen floor, finally letting themselves grieve properly. Caleb's nightmares had begun to fade. He still woke sometimes, calling for his mama, but now Ruth could go to him. She'd sit on the edge of his small bed, singing the same lullabies her own mother had sung to her siblings, and he'd drift back to sleep with his hand wrapped around her finger. Belle was learning to be a child again instead of a substitute mother. Yesterday Ruth had found her reading under the cottonwood tree, actually reading for pleasure instead of darning socks or changing diapers. The girl had looked up with such joy on her face that Ruth's heart had nearly broken. And Hannah. Sweet Hannah was thriving now, her cheeks pink, her laughter bubbling through the house like music they'd forgotten existed. Only Wyatt remained distant, respectful but wary. He watched Ruth with those old eyes in a young face, measuring her, testing her. Waiting, she suspected, for her to leave like all the others. The sound of hoofbeats pulled Ruth from her thoughts. She turned from the window to see Garrett riding up from the south pasture, his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. Even after 3 weeks, the sight of him still did something strange to her breathing. He sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, moving with the animal in that fluid way true cowboys had. His shoulders were broad enough to carry the weight of the world, and Lord knew he'd been trying to do exactly that since Caroline died. Ruth dried her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch as Garrett swung down from his horse. He moved with economical grace, not wasting a single motion. Everything about him spoke of quiet competence, of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. "Coffee's hot," she called. He nodded, tying his horse to the rail. "Much obliged." They'd developed a rhythm, she and Garrett. Small courtesies, respectful distance. But there were moments when their eyes would meet across the dinner table, or when he'd hand her something and their fingers would brush, and Ruth would feel something shift inside her chest. Something dangerous. Something that made her remember she was still a woman, not just a caretaker. She poured him coffee as he washed up at the basin on the porch. When he came inside, she set the cup at his usual place at the table. He sat with a sigh that came from deep in his bones, the kind of weariness that sleep couldn't touch. 12 head moved to the winter pasture, he said. Another 30 tomorrow. Ruth nodded, sliding a plate of cornbread toward him. The children want to help. Too cold, too dangerous. Wyatt's been helping since dawn. I saw him. Garrett's jaw tightened. That boy works himself like a man twice his age. Because he's trying to be you. Ruth sat down across from him, her own coffee cup warming her hands. He thinks if he works hard enough, carries enough, you'll forgive him. Forgive him for what? For not being able to save his mother. The words hung in the air between them. Garrett stared into his coffee cup, his weathered hands wrapped around the ceramic. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. I never blamed him. Have you told him that? Silence. The old clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds. Outside, they could hear the children's voices as Belle helped Caleb practice his letters on the porch. I don't know how to talk to him anymore, Garrett admitted. Don't know how to talk to any of them. Every time I look at them, I see her, Caroline. The way she'd laugh at Lucas's questions, the way she'd braid Belle's hair, the way she'd rock Hannah and sing those old songs. His voice cracked. Ruth reached across the table without thinking, covering his hand with hers. It was the first time she'd deliberately touched him, and the contact sent electricity up her arm. Tell me about her, Ruth said softly. About Caroline. Garrett looked up, surprise flickering across his face. You want to hear? Of course I do. She was their mother. She made this family what it is. I need to know her if I'm going to understand them. He studied her for a long moment, those gray eyes searching her face for something. Finally, he began to speak. Met her at a barn dance in town. She was 19, I was 23. Prettiest thing I'd ever seen, but that wasn't what made me notice her. It was her spirit. Caroline saw the good in everyone, the potential. She could look at a broken-down horse and see a champion, look at a failing ranch and see possibility. He paused, taking a sip of coffee. Maybe she saw too much good, trusted too easy. When things got hard after the drought 3 years back, she just kept believing it would all work out. Kept saying the rain would come, the cattle would survive, we'd be fine. That's not a failing, Ruth said. No, but when Hannah came early, when the fever took hold, Caroline didn't fight it the way she should have. She just accepted it, like she'd accepted every other hardship. Just smiled at me from that bed and said she was tired, said she'd fought enough. His hand turned under Ruth's, gripping her fingers. I held her hand while she died, watched the light go out of her eyes, and all I could think was that I'd failed her, failed to make her want to stay, failed to give her a reason to fight. Ruth's throat tightened. Garrett, you can't think like that. Can't help it. I'm a cowboy, Ruth. We fix things. We break horses, mend fences, solve problems. But I couldn't fix my dying life. Couldn't save her. What kind of man does that make me? A human one. Ruth squeezed his hand. You're not God, Garrett McCord. You're just a man doing his best with impossible circumstances. They sat like that for a moment, hands joined across the scarred wooden table. Then footsteps sounded on the porch, and they pulled apart, both of them suddenly aware of propriety, of what it might look like to the children. Belle poked her head inside. Mama Ruth, Caleb wants to show you his letters. I'll be right there, sweetheart. As Belle disappeared, Garrett stood, draining his coffee cup. Thank you for listening. Any time. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. Ruth, you're nothing like Caroline. Her stomach dropped. Here it comes, she thought, the comparison, the disappointment. But when he turned to look at her, his eyes were warm. Caroline built this family with love and optimism, made it something beautiful. But you? You're saving it with strength and practicality. You're what we need now. Someone who knows how to fight when things get hard, instead of just surrendering to them. He settled his hat on his head. Both kinds of love matter. Both kinds are necessary. And I'm grateful beyond words that you're here. Then he was gone, striding back toward the corral, leaving Ruth standing in the kitchen with her heart hammering against her ribs. 2 days later, Ruth took her second trip to town. She needed fabric for new shirts for the boys, who were growing like weeds, and flour for the week's baking. Garrett offered to accompany her, but she insisted she could manage the wagon alone. She needed to prove to herself, to him, to the whole town, that she belonged here. Red River Crossing looked different in full daylight than it had during her arrival. The main street stretched out under the vast Texas sky, buildings clustered together like they were seeking warmth from each other. The general store, the church, the saloon with its swinging doors, the doctor's office with its neatly painted shingle, and everywhere, people staring. Ruth held her head high as she climbed down from the wagon. She wore her best dress, the brown calico she'd mended 3 times but that still looked respectable. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. She'd scrubbed her hands until they were raw, trying to make them look less work-worn. It didn't matter. She knew what they saw. A plain woman, too tall, too broad, Not refined enough for Garrett McCord. Not pretty enough to replace the beloved Caroline. Inside Patterson's general store, the proprietor greeted her warmly enough. "Mrs. Brennan, good to see you. How's the family?" "Everyone's well, thank you. Hannah's thriving. Heard you saved that little one. Doc Boone said it was touch and go." "She's a fighter." Ruth moved through the store, gathering her supplies. She was aware of the other customers watching her, whispering behind their hands. She pretended not to notice. She was paying for her purchases when the bell above the door chimed. Ruth didn't need to turn around to know who'd entered. She could feel the temperature in the room drop. "Why, Mr. Patterson." Evangeline Shaw's voice dripped honey and poison in equal measure. "I didn't realize we had such distinguished company today." The older man shifted uncomfortably. "Afternoon, Mrs. Shaw." Evangeline glided through the store like she owned it. She wore a dress of deep burgundy silk that probably cost more than Ruth made in a year. Her blonde hair was elaborately styled, and diamonds glittered at her throat. She looked like she'd stepped out of a Dallas ballroom and somehow ended up in this dusty frontier town. "Miss Brennan." Evangeline's eyes swept over Ruth, cataloging every imperfection. "Still with the McCords, I see. How surprising." "Mrs. Brennan, actually," Ruth said evenly. "And yes, the children need me." "Do they?" Evangeline picked up a bolt of fabric, examining it with apparent fascination. "I've heard such interesting things about your arrival, that you came as a mail-order bride and somehow ended up as a nursemaid instead. One wonders what changed Garrett's mind." Ruth felt heat crawl up her neck, but she kept her voice steady. "I came to care for 5 motherless children. That's exactly what I'm doing." "Of course." Evangeline set down the fabric. "It's just that people are talking. A woman living alone in a house with a man. No marriage, no chaperone. It's not proper, Miss Brennan. Surely you can see how it looks." "Mrs. Brennan," Ruth corrected again. "And I sleep in my own room with a lock on the door. Everything is perfectly respectable." "Is it?" Evangeline moved closer, lowering her voice so only Ruth could hear. "Let me be frank, dear. You're not fooling anyone. We all know what you really are. A desperate woman who latched onto the first opportunity that came along. Poor Garrett, too grief-stricken to see he's being taken advantage of." Ruth's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I'm helping a family in need. There's nothing shameful in that." "Perhaps not. But there's nothing permanent about it either." Evangeline's smile was sharp as a knife. "Women like you never last out here. The work is too hard. The isolation too crushing. Give it another few weeks, and you'll run back to wherever you came from, just like all the others." "I'm not like the others." "No?" Evangeline's eyes glittered. "We'll see about that." She swept out of the store, leaving Ruth shaking with suppressed anger. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat awkwardly. "Don't mind her, Mrs. Brennan. Mrs. Shaw's always been particular about who she thinks is good enough for this town." "Particular is one word for it." Ruth gathered her packages. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson." Outside, she loaded the wagon with hands that trembled. She was tying down the last bundle when she heard footsteps behind her. "Mrs. Brennan?" She turned to find a Mexican woman approaching, perhaps 35 years old, with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. "I'm Rosa Vargas. I run the laundry." "It's nice to meet you." Rosa glanced around, making sure they weren't overheard. "I wanted to tell you, don't listen to Evangeline Shaw. That woman has poison in her heart and too much time on her hands. I'm trying not to let it bother me." Good, Rosa smiled. I know what it's like to be judged in this town. To have people look at you and decide you're not good enough. But you're doing good work with those children. Everyone can see it. The ones whose opinions matter anyway. Ruth felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. Thank you. That means more than you know. We outsiders have to stick together. Rosa patted her arm. You need anything, you come find me. As Ruth drove the wagon home, Rosa's words stayed with her. Outsiders. That's what they were, she and Rosa. Women who didn't quite fit into the neat boxes this town wanted to put them in. But maybe that was okay. Maybe being an outsider just meant you saw things more clearly than those on the inside. The ranch came into view as the sun began its descent. Ruth had come to love this site over the past 3 weeks. The simple house with its covered porch, the barn and corral, the cottonwood trees marking the creek bed. It wasn't much by some standards, but it was becoming home. Wyatt was in the corral, working with a young stallion, his movements careful and controlled. Belle sat on the porch with Hannah in her lap, pointing out birds. Lucas and Caleb were playing some elaborate game with sticks near the barn. This was a family, broken, grieving, slowly healing. And somehow, impossibly, Ruth had become part of it. That evening, after the children were fed and the dishes washed, after Belle had read to the little ones and Wyatt had completed his evening chores, they all gathered in the main room. It had become their routine, this nightly assembly. Garrett would sit in his chair by the fire, Hannah drowsing in his arms. The children would sprawl on the floor or perch on furniture, and Ruth would settle into the rocking chair Caroline had once occupied, mending in her lap, feeling the weight of the dead woman's presence, but no longer crushed by it. Tonight, though, Wyatt remained standing. He'd been quieter than usual all day, watching Ruth with that measuring look he got sometimes. Finally, as the fire crackled and the younger children began to yawn, he spoke. I have something to say. Everyone turned to look at him. Garrett straightened in his chair, instantly alert to any trouble. I was wrong about you, Mrs. Brennan. Wyatt's voice was steady, but his hands clenched at his sides. When you first came, I thought you'd be like the others. I thought you'd take one look at how hard it was and run. I didn't want to like you, because it hurt too much when they left. Ruth set down her mending, giving him her full attention. But you stayed. You saved Hannah. You helped Lucas find his voice again. You taught Belle it was okay to be a kid. You sing to Caleb when he has nightmares. His voice wavered slightly. You're not trying to replace our Ma. You're just trying to love us. And that's different. That's better, somehow. He crossed the room and stood in front of Ruth's chair. Then, with visible effort, he extended his hand. Welcome to the family, Mama Ruth. For real, this time. Ruth took his hand, but instead of shaking it, she pulled the boy into a hug. He stiffened for just a moment before melting against her, his head on her shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. All the grief he'd been holding back for 8 months, finally breaking free. I've got you, Ruth murmured. I've got you, and I'm not letting go. When Wyatt finally pulled back, his eyes were red, but his face was peaceful in a way it hadn't been since she'd arrived. He nodded once, then retreated to sit beside Lucas, who immediately leaned against his older brother's shoulder. Garrett's eyes met Ruth's across the room. The look he gave her was intense, layered with things neither of them was ready to name. Gratitude, yes. Respect, certainly. But underneath it all, something deeper. Something that made Ruth's breath catch. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Ruth stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge. The Texas sky at night was different than anything she'd known in Missouri. Bigger, clearer, like God had hung diamonds on black velvet and invited her to count them all. She heard the door open behind her, knew without looking that it was Garrett. "Cold out here," he said, draping a blanket over her shoulders. "It's beautiful, though." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Garrett spoke, his voice low. "What Wyatt said tonight, about you being part of the family." Ruth's heart began to pound. "Yes?" "He's right. You've become essential to us, Ruth. In just 3 weeks, you've changed everything. The house feels like a home again. The children are healing. I can breathe for the first time since Caroline died." He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I need you to know, this isn't just about the children anymore. It's about me, too. About what I feel when you're in the room. About how I look for you first thing in the morning and last thing at night." Ruth turned to face him. In the dim light from the window, his features were shadowed, making him look younger and more vulnerable than usual. "Garrett, I don't know what you're saying." "I'm saying I care about you. Not just as a housekeeper or a nursemaid. As a woman." He reached up, his calloused fingers gentle as they touched her cheek. "I know it's too soon. I know what people would say. But I can't stop thinking about you. About us. About the possibility of something more." Ruth's mind whirled. This was everything she'd never dared to hope for. A good man, a ready-made family, a home. But fear clutched at her chest, old wounds screaming warnings. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of hoping. Of believing this could be real." Her voice cracked. "Every time I've hoped for something, it's been taken away. My mother, my baby, every man who ever looked at me twice. What if I let myself believe, and then lose it all again?" Garrett pulled her into his arms, and Ruth went willingly, pressing her face against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He smelled like horse and leather and wood smoke, like safety. "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen," he said into her hair. "Life doesn't work that way, especially out here. But I can promise I'll be honest with you. I'll treat you with respect. I'll never make you feel like you're not enough." He pulled back slightly, tilting her face up to his. "You are enough, Ruth Brennan. You're more than enough. You're everything we needed, even when we didn't know we needed it." Then he kissed her, soft and tentative at first, asking permission. Ruth's hands came up to grip his shoulders as the kiss deepened, as 3 weeks of growing attraction finally found release. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me." Ruth's eyes flew open. "What?" "Marry me. Not just for the children, though they need you. Not just for propriety, though that would solve some problems. Marry me, because I'm falling in love with you, and I want to do this properly. Want to give you my name and my home, and everything I have." "Garrett, it's only been 3 weeks." I know it's fast, but I'm a practical man, Ruth. And practically speaking, you're the best thing that's happened to this family since Caroline. I don't want to risk losing you because I was too proud or too slow to speak up." Ruth's mind raced. This was insane. Marrying a man she barely knew, taking on 5 children, tying herself to this hard land and harder life. Everything logical in her screamed to slow down, to think, to wait. But then she looked at Garrett's face, open and honest in the starlight. She thought about Wyatt's acceptance tonight, about Belle's joy, about Lucas finding his voice, about Caleb's nightmares fading, about baby Hannah's laughter, about the possibility of finally belonging somewhere. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'll marry you." Garrett's face transformed with a smile that made him look 10 years younger. He kissed her again, deeper this time, his arms tight around her waist. When he pulled back, he was laughing softly. "Mrs. Ruth McCord has a nice sound to it." "It does," Ruth smiled through sudden tears. "It really does." They stood together on that porch for a long time, wrapped in the blanket and each other, watching the stars wheel slowly across the infinite Texas sky. Inside the house, 5 children slept peacefully for the first time in months. And Ruth Brennan, the woman who'd been told she'd never be good enough for any man, finally understood that she'd simply been waiting for the right family to choose her back. Tomorrow they would tell the children. Tomorrow they would face whatever gossip and judgment the town wanted to throw at them. Tomorrow they would begin planning a wedding. But tonight, this moment, was theirs alone. A cowboy and a woman who'd both been broken by loss, finding something whole and new in each other's arms. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate, and on the porch of the McCord Ranch, hope bloomed like flowers in the desert after rain, unexpected and precious, and worth fighting for. The morning after Garrett's proposal dawned cold and clear, the kind of December day that made Texas feel like the edge of the world. Ruth woke in her narrow bed with her heart pounding, half convinced the previous night had been a dream. But when she emerged from her room, still tying her hair back, she found Garrett waiting in the kitchen with coffee already brewed and a smile that made her stomach flip. "Morning, future Mrs. McCord." She laughed, the sound nervous and giddy. "We should tell the children." "After breakfast. Let them wake up proper first." They moved around the kitchen in comfortable synchrony, preparing the morning meal. Ruth sliced bread while Garrett fried bacon. She scrambled eggs while he set the table. It was domestic and ordinary, and somehow more intimate than the kiss they'd shared under the stars. The children tumbled in one by one, sleepy and disheveled. Caleb climbed immediately into Ruth's lap, still seeking that morning reassurance that she hadn't vanished in the night. Belle helped Hannah into her high chair. Lucas and Wyatt took their usual seats, the older boy already looking more at peace than he had in months. When everyone was settled and eating, Garrett cleared his throat. "Kids, Mama Ruth and I have something to tell you." 5 pairs of eyes turned toward them, curious and slightly wary. Children who'd lost one parent never quite trusted good news anymore. Ruth reached across the table and took Garrett's hand. "Your father and I are getting married." For a moment, silence. Then chaos erupted. Caleb jumped up, nearly knocking over his plate. "Does that mean Mama Ruth will be our real mama?" Belle's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy ones. "I knew it! I told Wyatt you were different." Lucas simply smiled, wide and genuine, and said, "Mama Caroline would like you, Mama Ruth." Hannah banged her spoon on her high chair, sensing the excitement even if she didn't understand it. Only Wyatt remained quiet. He pushed his food around his plate, his expression unreadable. Ruth's heart sank. They'd come so far last night. Had she misread everything? Then Wyatt looked up, and his eyes were wet. "You promise you're staying? For real? Forever?" Ruth stood and walked around the table to kneel beside his chair. "Wyatt, I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen, but I promise I will fight to stay. I promise I'll love all of you as hard as I know how. And I promise that if I do ever have to leave, it won't be because I wanted to." He studied her face for a long moment. Then he extended his hand, formal and grown up. "Welcome to the family, Mama Ruth. Official this time." She took his hand, then pulled him into a hug. Behind her, she heard the other children clapping and cheering. She heard Garrett's quiet laughter. And she felt, for the first time in her life, like she'd finally come home. The wedding was planned for 2 weeks later, the first Sunday in January. It would be a simple ceremony at the Methodist church in town, just family and whatever friends chose to attend. Ruth threw herself into preparations, grateful for the distraction from her nerves. She had no wedding dress, no trousseau, nothing a proper bride should have. But Rosa Vargas arrived at the ranch 3 days before the ceremony with a beautiful lace mantilla that had belonged to her grandmother. "For your hair," Rosa said, pressing it into Ruth's hands. "Every bride needs something special." "Rosa, I can't take this." "You can and you will. Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. But you're going to look beautiful, and that horrible Evangeline Shaw can go choke on her jealousy." Ruth laughed despite herself. "You don't like her much, do you? She called my husband a dirty Mexican when he tried to repair her fence. Said she didn't want his kind touching her property." Rosa's eyes flashed. "So no, I don't like her. And I think it's wonderful that you're marrying Garrett and showing her that good things happen to good people, not just rich witches." But Evangeline wasn't going quietly. 2 days before the wedding, she arrived at the ranch in her expensive carriage, ostensibly to bring a wedding gift. Ruth met her at the door, determined to be gracious. "Mrs. Shaw, how kind of you to come. I wouldn't miss it." Evangeline swept inside without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes catalogued everything: the clean floors, the mended curtains, the smell of fresh bread. "You've certainly made yourself indispensable, haven't you?" "I've tried to help where I could." "Oh, I'm sure you have." Evangeline set a wrapped package on the table. "A wedding gift. Some linens for your new life as Mrs. McCord." "Thank you. That's very generous." Evangeline moved closer, lowering her voice. "Let me be honest with you, dear. This marriage is a mistake. Garrett's not thinking clearly. He's grief-stricken and desperate, and you happen to be convenient. Once the novelty wears off, once he really looks at you, he'll realize what he's done." Ruth felt the words like physical blows, but she kept her voice steady. "I appreciate your concern, but Garrett and I understand each other perfectly." "Do you?" Evangeline's smile was cruel. "Have you told him about Philadelphia? About the baby you lost? About Edward Morrison and his family's accusations?" Ruth's blood went cold. "How do you know about that?" "I have connections, dear, and I use them. Did you really think you could just start over out here? That your past wouldn't follow you?" She moved toward the door, then paused. "I'm trying to help you see reason. Leave now, before the wedding, before you humiliate yourself and him. I'll even give you money for the train fare." "I'm not leaving." "Then you're a fool. And when this all falls apart, when Garrett realizes his mistake, and everyone in town knows your sordid history, don't say I didn't warn you." After Evangeline left, Ruth stood frozen in the kitchen, her hands shaking. The past she'd tried so hard to outrun had found her anyway. And now it was being weaponized against her by a bitter woman who wanted what Ruth had. That night, she told Garrett everything. They sat in front of the fire after the children had gone to bed, the house quiet around them. Ruth's hands were twisted together in her lap as she spoke, telling him about Edward Morrison, about the promises he'd made and broken, about the pregnancy and the tiny baby who'd lived for 10 precious minutes before slipping away. "I was 20 years old, and I thought I was in love," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was the son of the family I worked for. He said he'd marry me. I believed him." Garrett listened without interrupting, his face grave. "When I told him about the baby, he denied everything, called me a liar and a whore. His father threw me out with nothing. I worked whatever jobs I could find, but I was pregnant and showing, and nobody wanted to hire me." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I was carrying laundry up 3 flights of stairs when something tore inside me. I bled for hours. The baby came too early." Her voice broke. "She was so tiny, so perfect. I held her, and she looked at me with these huge, dark eyes, and I thought maybe she'd make it. But then she just stopped breathing. 10 minutes. That's all I got." Garrett pulled her into his arms, holding her as she cried. She could feel the strength in him, the solid reality of his body against hers, and it anchored her when the memories threatened to pull her under. "I'm so sorry," he said into her hair. "God, Ruth, I'm so sorry you went through that alone. Evangeline knows. She has sworn statements from the Morrisons. She threatened to tell everyone unless I leave." She felt Garrett's body tense. That woman has no right. But she does have the information, and if she shares it, what will people think? What will they say about you marrying someone like me? Garrett pulled back so he could see her face. "Listen to me. I don't care what Evangeline Shaw says. I don't care what anyone says. What happened to you wasn't your fault. You were young, and you trusted someone who didn't deserve it. That's not a sin. That's just being human." "But the baby—" "You didn't kill your baby, Ruth. You worked yourself to exhaustion trying to survive because nobody would help you. That's not your shame to carry. That's Edward Morrison's. That's his family's. That's a society that throws out women who make mistakes, while the men who made those mistakes walk away clean." He cupped her face in his hands. "You are good. You are worthy. And I am proud to marry you. If Evangeline wants to spread poison, let her. We'll face it together." Ruth searched his eyes, looking for doubt or disgust or disappointment. She found none of it, just steady, unwavering acceptance. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too, all of you, including the parts you think are broken." The wedding took place on a cold, bright Sunday morning. The Methodist church was packed, which surprised Ruth, until she realized that half the town had come out of curiosity rather than support. They wanted to see what Garrett McCord's plain mail-order bride looked like, wanted to judge whether he'd made a terrible mistake. But Ruth didn't care. She walked down that aisle in her best dress, Rosa's lace mantilla in her hair, her head held high. The 5 children sat in the front pew, scrubbed clean and dressed in their Sunday best. And at the altar stood Garrett, looking uncomfortable in his only suit, but smiling at her like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Reverend McAllister performed the ceremony, his voice resonating through the small church. "Do you, Garrett James McCord, take Ruth Caroline Brennan to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Garrett's voice was firm, certain, the voice of a man making a choice he'd never regret. "And do you, Ruth Caroline Brennan, take Garrett James McCord to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Ruth looked at Garrett, at the children, at the life she was choosing. I do. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The church erupted in applause. Caleb cheered. Belle cried happy tears. Lucas clapped. Wyatt smiled, genuine and warm. And baby Hannah laughed, that bubbling giggle that had become the soundtrack of their healing. Garrett kissed her in front of everyone, a public claiming that left no doubt about his commitment. When they broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. Outside the church, most of the town gathered to offer congratulations. Dr. Boone shook Garrett's hand warmly. Rosa hugged Ruth and whispered, "You showed them." Even grumpy old Mr. Patterson from the general store wished them well. But standing apart, watching with cold eyes, was Evangeline Shaw. She wore black, as if attending a funeral rather than a wedding. And beside her stood a well-dressed man Ruth didn't recognize, tall and lean, with calculating eyes. "Who's that?" Ruth asked Garrett quietly. His jaw tightened. "Silas Drummond, Evangeline's brother, land speculator. He's been trying to buy my ranch for years." "Why?" "Because the railroad's coming through. My land will be worth a fortune if they choose my route. Silas wants to profit from it." Ruth watched as Evangeline and Silas spoke in low tones, their heads close together. The way they looked at her and Garrett sent ice down her spine. They were planning something. She could feel it. But then Belle tugged on her sleeve, asking to throw rice, and Caleb wanted to know if they could have cake, and the moment passed. Ruth pushed her worries aside. Today was for joy. Tomorrow would come soon enough with its troubles. The small reception was held at Rose's house, since the ranch was too far for everyone to travel. There was cake and coffee and laughter. The children ran wild, finally allowed to be children, without grief weighing them down. Garrett kept his hand on Ruth's waist, anchoring her to his side, making it clear to everyone that she was his choice, his wife, his partner. As the afternoon wore on and people began to leave, Ruth found herself standing in Rose's small garden, looking out over the town. She could see the church steeple, the general store, the houses clustered together. This was her home now. These people, for better or worse, were her community. Garrett came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Happy?" "Terrified," she admitted. "But yes, happy." "Good." He kissed the top of her head. "Because I plan to make you happy every day for the rest of our lives." They rode back to the ranch as the sun set, the 5 children piled in the back of the wagon, chattering excitedly about the wedding. Ruth sat beside Garrett on the bench seat, their shoulders touching, his hand occasionally leaving the reins to squeeze hers. When they pulled up to the house, it looked different somehow, more solid, more permanent. This was hers now, not just a place she worked, but her home, her family, her life. That night, after the children were finally settled and the house was quiet, Ruth and Garrett stood in the doorway of what was now their shared bedroom. The room that had been his and Caroline's. Ruth had worried it would feel wrong, but Caroline's presence wasn't oppressive here. It felt more like a blessing, like the first wife was watching over them and approving of this new beginning. "You're sure about this?" Garrett asked, suddenly uncertain in a way he hadn't been all day. Ruth took his hand and led him inside, closing the door behind them. "I'm sure about you, about us, about this family we're building together." Outside, the Texas wind whispered through the cottonwoods. Inside, 2 broken people came together and found themselves whole. And in the rooms down the hall, 5 children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that their family was complete again. 3 weeks of marriage passed in a blur of domestic happiness. Ruth settled into her new role as wife and mother, finding joy in the simple routines of ranch life. She learned to ride a horse, though not gracefully, which made Garrett laugh every time she mounted up. She helped with the cattle, surprising herself with how much she enjoyed the physical labor. She continued to care for the children, but now with the added security of permanence. The town slowly began to accept her. Women who'd been cold at first started nodding to her at church. Invitations trickled in for social gatherings. Ruth was becoming part of the community, earning her place through steady work and genuine kindness. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. It started with whispers. Ruth would be in the general store, and conversations would stop when she entered. People would look at her with new speculation in their eyes. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on her family and her new life. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a grim-faced man in a dark suit. He handed it to Garrett without a word and rode away, leaving dust and dread in his wake. Garrett opened it with trembling hands. Ruth watched his face go pale as he read. "What is it?" He didn't answer, just handed her the paper. Ruth's eyes scanned the formal language, her heart sinking with every word. It was a formal complaint filed with the county courthouse, an inquiry into the moral fitness of Garrett McCord as a guardian to his children. The complaint stated that an unmarried woman had lived in his house for weeks before their marriage, creating an environment of moral corruption unfit for children. And at the bottom, signed with a flourish, was Evangeline Shaw's name. "They're trying to take the children," Ruth whispered. Garrett's hands clenched into fists. "Over my dead body." But fear curled in Ruth's stomach, because she knew what this really was. It wasn't about the children's welfare. It was about destroying her happiness, about punishing her for daring to take what Evangeline thought should be hers. The hearing was set for 1 month away, 4 weeks to prepare, 4 weeks to gather evidence and witnesses, 4 weeks to prove they were fit parents, 4 weeks to fight for their family. That night, with the children asleep and the house dark around them, Garrett and Ruth sat by the fire and made their plans. They would not go down without a fight. They would not let Evangeline Shaw's jealousy and Silas Drummond's greed destroy what they'd built. "We'll get through this," Garrett said, holding Ruth's hand so tight it almost hurt. "We've survived worse, both of us, and we'll survive this too." Ruth wanted to believe him, but in the darkness, listening to the wind howl across the plains, she couldn't shake the feeling that their hardest battle was still ahead. The days following the delivery of the complaint were the longest of Ruth's life. She moved through the ranch like a woman in a dream, cooking meals she barely tasted, tending children while her mind spun with worst-case scenarios. What if they lost? What if the judge decided she was unfit? What if 5 children who'd finally begun to heal were torn from the only stability they'd known? Garrett threw himself into work with frightening intensity. He rode out before dawn and returned after dark, pushing himself and his horses to exhaustion. Ruth understood. He was a man who solved problems through action, and this problem couldn't be lassoed or broken or built. All he could do was wait for the hearing and pray that justice prevailed. But the children sensed something was wrong. They always did. Children who'd lost one parent developed an almost supernatural ability to detect adult anxiety. It was Wyatt who finally confronted them. A week after the complaint arrived, he found Ruth in the kitchen, kneading bread with more force than necessary. "What's happening?" His voice was flat, braced for bad news. Ruth's hands stilled in the dough. She'd promised these children honesty. No more pretty lies that shattered when tested. "Someone filed a complaint with the county. They're questioning whether your father and I should be raising you." Wyatt's face went white. "They want to take us away?" "They want a hearing, to decide if we're fit parents." "Because of you?" Because you lived here before the wedding? Ruth forced herself to meet his eyes. Yes, and because of things in my past that some people think make me unsuitable. For a long moment, Wyatt just stared at her. Then his jaw set in a way that reminded Ruth exactly of his father. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You saved Hannah. You helped Lucas talk again. You make Belle laugh. You chase away Caleb's nightmares. If that's not being a good mother, I don't know what is. The law doesn't always see things the way we do. Then the law's an idiot. He grabbed a dish towel and started drying the clean plates with angry, precise movements. What do? We fight. We tell the truth. We show them what this family really is. And if they don't listen? Ruth's throat tightened. Then we keep fighting anyway. News of the hearing spread through Red River Crossing like wildfire. A town that had slowly been warming to Ruth now watched her with renewed suspicion. The gossip that had died down roared back to life, fed by carefully placed whispers from Evangeline's circle. Ruth overheard it everywhere, in the general store, living in sin under that roof, and now acting surprised there are consequences. At church, those poor children exposed to such moral corruption. On the street, Garrett McCord should have known better than to bring in some desperate mail-order woman. But not everyone turned against them. Dr. Boone made a point of greeting Ruth warmly in public, his respect lending her credibility. Rosa Vargas became even more vocal in her support, telling anyone who'd listen that Ruth was the best thing that had happened to those children. And to Ruth's surprise, several ranch families who'd known Garrett for years began stopping by the ranch to express their support. "Don't let Evangeline Shaw bully you," said Mrs. Henderson, whose husband ran the ranch to the east. "That woman's had her claws out for Garrett since Caroline died, maybe before. This isn't about protecting children. It's about a bitter woman who can't stand seeing someone else happy." Still, the support felt fragile compared to the weight of opposition. And Evangeline wasn't finished. 2 weeks before the hearing, she paid another visit to the ranch. This time she brought her brother Silas, that lean speculator with calculating eyes. Garrett met them at the door, his face hard as granite. "You're not welcome here." "Now, Garrett." Silas's voice was smooth as oil. "Let's be civilized about this. We're neighbors, after all." "Neighbors don't try to steal each other's children." "Steal?" Evangeline pressed a hand to her chest in mock offense. "We're trying to protect those children. Surely you can see how this looks. An unmarried woman living in your house, alone with you and 5 impressionable young minds." "We're married now. Have been for weeks." "After the damage was done," Silas interjected. "After who knows what those children witnessed. What kind of example you set?" Ruth stepped onto the porch beside Garrett. "The children witnessed a family healing. They witnessed kindness and care, and people doing their best in impossible circumstances. If that's corruption, I'll gladly stand guilty." Evangeline's eyes glittered with malice. "Oh, you'll stand guilty of more than that, I imagine. Once certain facts come to light. Facts about your time in Philadelphia, about Edward Morrison, about the baby that died under mysterious circumstances." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. She'd known Evangeline would use her past, but hearing it spoken aloud, weaponized, made her feel naked and ashamed. Garrett's arm went around her waist, solid and protective. "Get off my property." "We're going," Silas said smoothly. "But think about this, Garrett. You're a good man who made a mistake in a moment of weakness. You can still fix this. Send Mrs. McCord away. The hearing goes away. You keep your children. Everyone's happy. Except Ruth." She's a grown woman. She'll survive. But those children? They need stability. Not a woman with a sordid past, pretending to be something she's not. Those children need their mother, and that's exactly what Ruth is. After they left, Garrett found Ruth in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with her head in her hands. He knelt in front of her, taking her trembling fingers in his. "Don't let them do this to you. They're going to destroy me in that hearing, parade every mistake I've ever made in front of the whole town. Let them. We'll tell the truth and trust that it's enough." "What if it's not?" He pulled her close, and Ruth buried her face in his shoulder. "Then we appeal. We fight harder. We don't stop fighting until we win." But Ruth couldn't shake the fear that had settled in her bones. She'd fought before, fought to survive after Edward Morrison betrayed her, fought to make a life from nothing. And every time, just when she thought she'd found solid ground, it had crumbled beneath her. The night before the hearing, Ruth couldn't sleep. She slipped out of bed and went to check on the children, a ritual she'd developed over the months. First, Hannah, sleeping peacefully in her crib, thumb in her mouth. Then Caleb, sprawled across his bed like a starfish, finally free of nightmares. Lucas, curled tight under his blankets, Caroline's locket still under his pillow. Belle, serene and beautiful, looking so much like the young woman she'd become. And finally Wyatt, in the small room he'd claimed as his own space. To her surprise, he was awake, sitting by his window, looking out at the moonlit prairie. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly. "Keep thinking about tomorrow. About what happens if they take us away." Ruth sat on the edge of his bed. "You know your father will never let that happen. But what if he can't stop it? What if the judge decides you're not good enough, and Pa's not fit because he chose you?" His voice cracked. "It's not fair. We finally got our family back. We finally got you. And now they want to tear it all apart again. Wyatt, listen to me. Whatever happens tomorrow, you need to know something. These months with you, with all of you, have been the best of my life. You gave me something I thought I'd never have. A family, a home, a reason to wake up every morning and believe the world might actually have good things in it. You gave us all that too. Then we're even." She smiled through her tears. "And tomorrow, when we walk into that courthouse, we walk in together, as a family. And no matter what they say, no matter what they decide, that doesn't change. We're a family now, in the ways that really matter." Wyatt nodded, his jaw set. "I'm going to tell them, the judge. I'm going to tell him everything you've done for us, how you saved Hannah, how you helped Lucas, how you made this place feel like home again. You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do, because it's the truth. And if they're going to judge you, they need to hear the whole truth, not just the parts Evangeline Shaw wants them to know." The courthouse in Red River Crossing was packed when they arrived the next morning. It seemed like half the county had turned out, some to support the McCords, others to watch the spectacle of their downfall. Ruth held her head high as they walked through the crowd, Garrett at her side, the 5 children behind them like soldiers marching into battle. Judge Cornelius Webb presided, a red-faced man in his 60s with hard eyes and a reputation for strict interpretation of the law. He was, Ruth had learned, a cousin of Silas Drummond. The deck was already stacked against them. The hearing began with Evangeline's testimony. She stood before the judge in her finest dress, every inch the respectable society woman, and painted a picture of moral corruption and child endangerment. "Your Honor, I visited the McCord Ranch multiple times during the period in question. Each time, I observed Miss Brennan, as she was then, behaving with inappropriate familiarity toward Mr. McCord, touching his arm, sitting too close at meals, looking at him in ways that were entirely unsuitable for an unmarried woman and a widower. "And the children?" the judge asked. Exposed to this daily. Young, impressionable minds, watching their father engage in what can only be called a courtship, under the same roof where they slept. It sets a terrible example, Your Honor. It teaches them that propriety and morals don't matter. Silas Drummond went next. His testimony focused on Ruth's past. He produced documents, sworn statements from the Morrison family in Philadelphia, painting Ruth as a seductress who had manipulated their innocent son and then fled west after her illegitimate baby died under suspicious circumstances. "We have reason to believe Miss Brennan may have had something to do with the infant's death," Silas said smoothly. "She was found with the dead baby, alone, having told no one she was even in labor. It's all very questionable, Your Honor." Ruth felt the courtroom's eyes on her, judging, condemning. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear. But Garrett's hand found hers under the table and squeezed tight. She wasn't alone this time. She wasn't facing this nightmare by herself. When it was their turn to present their case, Dr. Boone testified first. He spoke matter-of-factly about Hannah's near death from fever, about Ruth's skilled and decisive intervention, about the marked improvement in all the children's health and emotional well-being since her arrival. "In my medical opinion, Mrs. McCord has been nothing but beneficial to those children. They were failing before she came. Now they're thriving." Reverend McAllister testified about the propriety of their courtship and marriage, about how Ruth had slept in a separate, locked room before the wedding, about the genuine love and respect he'd observed between the couple. "This is a good Christian family, doing their best to heal after tragedy," he said firmly. "There's no scandal here, just ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with grace." Then Garrett took the stand. He spoke simply, without flourishes, in the plain language of a man who'd never learned to lie. "Ruth saved my family. Not just Hannah's life, though that alone would be enough. She saved all of us. My children were drowning in grief, and I didn't know how to reach them. She did. She loved them when they were at their worst. She stayed when staying was hard. She chose us every single day, even when we gave her every reason to leave." He looked directly at the judge. "You want to know if she's fit to be their mother? She already is their mother, not because she gave birth to them, but because she shows up, because she fights for them, because she loves them with everything she has. Take her away from us, and you'll break 5 hearts that have already been broken once. I won't let that happen. Not without a fight." Finally, the children testified. Belle went first, her voice clear despite her tears. She talked about Ruth teaching her to read difficult books, about how Mama Ruth said it was okay to be smart and ambitious. Lucas spoke about finding his voice again, about how Ruth never pushed, but just waited patiently until he was ready. Caleb, so small and earnest, told the judge that Mama Ruth sang away his bad dreams and made him feel safe. Then Wyatt stood. At 12 years old, he looked like a young man, tall and serious, carrying the weight of his family on his shoulders. "Your Honor, I need you to understand something. When my mother died, I wanted to die too. Not in any dramatic way. I just stopped caring if I lived or not. I worked myself into the ground, trying to be the man my father needed, trying to fill the hole Mama left behind. And I was failing. We were all failing." He looked at Ruth, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Then Mama Ruth came, and I hated her at first. Hated her for not being my real mama. Hated her for being alive when Mama Caroline was dead. I was cruel to her, pushed her away, waited for her to leave like all the others. But she didn't leave. She stayed and she fought for us. She fought for me even when I was horrible to her. She saved my baby sister. She helped my brothers. She loved us when we were unlovable. And she did it all without asking for anything in return. His voice broke. You want to take her away because she lived in our house for a few weeks before the wedding? Because she helped us when we needed it most? That's not protecting children, Your Honor. That's punishing someone for being good and kind and brave. The courtroom was silent. Even Judge Webb looked moved, though he quickly schooled his features back to neutrality. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Every head turned as an elderly woman entered, leaning heavily on a cane. She was dressed in widow's black, her white hair pulled back severely, her blue eyes fierce and bright. Garrett stood so quickly his chair fell over. Mrs. Winters? Dorothy Winters, Caroline's mother, walked slowly down the aisle. She moved like a woman who'd traveled a long distance in a short time, exhaustion in every line of her body, but determination in her stride. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying despite her age. I apologize for my late arrival. I came as soon as I heard about this travesty. Judge Webb frowned. And you are? Dorothy Winters. I'm the mother of Caroline McCord, the children's deceased mother. I think that gives me standing to speak here. Proceed. Dorothy turned to face the courtroom, her gaze sweeping over Evangeline and Silas with withering contempt, before settling on Ruth. 3 weeks before my daughter died, she wrote me a letter. She knew she wasn't going to survive. Knew it in her bones, even though she never told Garrett. Ma Caroline always did have a sense about these things. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased from being read many times. She told me that if the worst happened, Garrett would need help. Not just any help, someone special, someone strong enough to do the hard things, someone good enough to love damaged children, someone who'd fought their own battles and survived. Dorothy's voice wavered, but remained strong. She wrote, Mama, I don't know her name yet, but when you meet her, you'll know. She'll be the one who doesn't give up, the one who shows up every day and does what needs doing, regardless of whether it's proper or easy or fair. She'll be the one who fights for my babies when I can't anymore. She looked directly at Ruth. My daughter chose you from beyond the grave. She knew exactly what her children would need. And if Evangeline Shaw or anyone else in this courtroom thinks their judgment is better than Caroline's, they're fools. The courtroom erupted. People were crying, arguing, calling out support. Judge Webb banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. When the room finally quieted, Dorothy walked slowly to where Ruth sat. She reached out one weathered hand and touched Ruth's tear-stained face. Welcome to the family, daughter. Caroline would have loved you. I can see that now. That night, waiting for the judge's decision, the entire family gathered around the fire. Nobody spoke much. There was nothing left to say. They'd told their truth. Now they could only wait and hope it was enough. Ruth sat in the rocking chair with Hannah in her arms, the baby finally asleep after a fussy evening. Around her, the other children were scattered, seeking comfort in proximity. Caleb leaned against her legs, Belle sat at her feet. Lucas and Wyatt occupied the sofa, close enough to touch if needed. Garrett stood by the window, looking out at the darkness, his shoulders tight with tension. "Whatever happens," Ruth said softly, "I want you all to know something. These months have been the greatest gift of my life. You gave me a family when I thought I'd never have one. You gave me purpose. You gave me love. No court can take that away. No judge can undo what we've built together." "We're not going to lose," Wyatt said fiercely. "We can't. It's not fair." "Life's not always fair, son," Garrett said without turning from the window. "But sometimes, if you fight hard enough, you can bend it toward justice. And that's what we did today. We fought. Now we trust that truth is stronger than lies." They sat together in the firelight, a family bound not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the simple daily decision to keep showing up for each other. And outside, the Texas wind whispered through the darkness, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and whatever judgment it might bring. The morning after the hearing dawned gray and cold, matching the anxiety that had settled over the McCord Ranch like a fog. Judge Webb had announced he needed time to deliberate, time to review the testimony and evidence. 3 days, he'd said. 3 days that stretched ahead like an eternity. Ruth threw herself into work, needing the distraction of physical labor. She scrubbed floors that were already clean. She cooked elaborate meals nobody had the appetite to eat. She reorganized the pantry, mended clothes that didn't need mending, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into worst-case scenarios. The children moved through the house like ghosts, their newfound happiness dimmed by uncertainty. Even Hannah seemed to sense the tension, fussing more than usual, clinging to Ruth with desperate little hands. On the second day, Rosa Vargas arrived with a basket of food and a fierce determination to help however she could. "You need to eat," she said, setting bread and tamales on the kitchen table. "All of you. Starving won't help anything." "I can't eat. Can't stop thinking about what happens if we lose." Rosa gripped Ruth's shoulders, forcing her to meet her eyes. "Listen to me. You're not going to lose. That judge would have to be blind and stupid not to see what you've done for this family. Judge Webb is Silas Drummond's cousin. He's probably already decided against us. Then we fight harder. We get more people to speak for you. We show the whole county what kind of woman you really are." And that's exactly what Rosa did. Over the next 2 days, she became a one-woman campaign machine, going door to door through Red River Crossing, talking to everyone who'd listen. She organized a petition of support, gathering signatures from dozens of families who'd witnessed Ruth's transformation of the McCord household. Dr. Boone wrote a detailed medical report documenting the children's improved health. Reverend McAllister gathered testimony from church members about Ruth's character and dedication. Even grumpy old Mr. Patterson from the general store signed a statement praising her reliability and honesty. But the most unexpected support came from Dorothy Winters. Caroline's mother had stayed in town after the hearing, taking a room at the Red River Inn. On the morning of the 3rd day, she appeared at the ranch in a hired wagon, her face grim with purpose. "We need to talk," she said, settling herself at the kitchen table while Ruth made coffee. "About Evangeline Shaw." "What about her?" "I've known that woman for 20 years. She was obsessed with Garrett, even before he married Caroline. Used to make excuses to visit the ranch, bringing pies and acting like butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. Caroline saw right through her, but she was too kind to say anything mean." Dorothy accepted the coffee cup Ruth offered. After Caroline died, Evangeline started circling like a vulture, came to the funeral dressed like a grieving widow herself, started talking about how someone needed to help poor Garrett with those children. Everyone knew what she really wanted. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand what you're fighting. This isn't about morality or protecting children. It's about a bitter, jealous woman who can't stand seeing someone else have what she wants. Dorothy's eyes were sharp as flint. Evangeline will do anything to destroy you. And her brother will help, because destroying Garrett means getting his land. I know, but knowing doesn't help us stop them. Maybe it does. Dorothy leaned forward. I spent yesterday asking questions around town. Turns out Evangeline has enemies, lots of them. Women she's snubbed. Families she's judged. People who'd love to see her taken down a peg. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we gather those people. We show the judge that this isn't about a concerned citizen protecting children. It's about a vindictive woman wielding the law as a weapon because she didn't get her way. That afternoon, Dorothy's plan began to take shape. Mrs. Henderson came forward with a story about Evangeline refusing to help when her daughter was sick, claiming the family was too common to associate with. Mr. Chen from the laundry told how Evangeline had tried to run him out of town for being Chinese. Even some of Evangeline's own church circle broke ranks, tired of her judgment and manipulation. By the evening of the third day, they had a thick folder of testimony and statements, all painting a picture of Evangeline Shaw as someone motivated not by righteousness, but by spite. But late that night, Ruth received an unexpected visitor. A knock at the door revealed Evangeline herself, standing alone on the porch without her usual entourage. She looked smaller somehow, less formidable in the lamplight. "May I come in?" Ruth wanted to slam the door in her face, wanted to tell this woman exactly what she thought of her cruel campaign. But something in Evangeline's expression gave her pause. She looked defeated, desperate. "Garrett's in the barn. The children are asleep. I came to see you, not them." Ruth led her to the kitchen, poured coffee more out of habit than hospitality. They sat across from each other at the scarred wooden table, two women on opposite sides of a war neither had chosen, but both were trapped in. "I'm going to lose," Evangeline said finally. "Aren't I?" "I don't know. Your cousin is the judge." "Cornelius is many things, but he's not completely corrupt." And Dorothy Winters showing up changed everything. Everyone loved Caroline. If her own mother thinks you're fit, that carries weight. Ruth said nothing, waiting. "I should withdraw the complaint. I know that. But I can't seem to make myself do it." Evangeline's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "Do you know what it's like to want something so badly that you'd destroy yourself to get it? To watch someone have the life you dreamed of and know you'll never have it?" "Actually, I do." Evangeline looked up, surprised. "I spent years watching other women get married, have children, build families, while I scrubbed their floors and washed their clothes. I knew I wasn't pretty enough, wasn't refined enough. Every time a man looked past me to someone prettier, it confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't worthy of being chosen." "Then you understand." "I understand the pain, but I don't understand using it as an excuse to hurt others." Ruth leaned forward. "Evangeline, I didn't steal Garrett from you. He was never yours to lose. And these children need stability, not adults fighting over them like they're prizes." "I know." The admission seemed to cost her. "But Silas won't let it go. He wants that land. The railroad's coming through, and he stands to make a fortune. He pushed me into this complaint, said we could get the children removed and force Garrett to sell. And you went along with it because? Because I'm a foolish, bitter woman who thought maybe if Garrett lost everything, he'd need me. He'd see that I was the right choice all along. She laughed harshly. Pathetic, isn't it? It's human. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Evangeline stood. I won't withdraw the complaint. Silas would never forgive me, and I need his financial support. But I won't fight anymore either. What happens, happens. After she left, Ruth sat alone in the kitchen, trying to process the encounter. She'd expected to hate Evangeline Shaw, had wanted to see her as a villain in simple black and white. But life was never that simple. Evangeline was just another wounded woman making terrible choices out of fear and loneliness. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made her human. The fourth day arrived with a summons. Judge Webb had reached his decision. They were to appear at the courthouse at 2 o'clock. The family dressed in their Sunday best, moving through the morning in anxious silence. Ruth braided Belle's hair with trembling fingers. Garrett shaved twice, his hands unsteady. The boys put on their good shirts without being asked, understanding the gravity of the moment. Only Hannah seemed unaffected, babbling happily as Ruth dressed her, reaching for her mother's face with sticky fingers. Mama, Mama. The word hit Ruth like a physical blow. This child knew her as mother now. They all did. What would it do to them if she was torn away? The courthouse was even more crowded than it had been for the hearing. Apparently the whole county wanted to witness Judge Webb's decision. Ruth walked through the crowd with her head high, Garrett's hand firmly gripping hers, the children following in their wake like ducklings. Judge Webb entered, and the room fell silent. He looked older than he had 3 days ago, tired, like the weight of his decision had cost him sleep. He shuffled through papers on his desk, cleared his throat, and finally looked up. This has been one of the most difficult cases I've had to rule on, he began. The letter of the law is clear. An unmarried woman living in a household with a widower and his children does create an appearance of impropriety, regardless of actual conduct. Ruth's heart sank. Here it comes. However, Judge Webb's voice grew stronger. The spirit of the law is to protect children from harm. And in reviewing all the testimony, all the evidence, I find no evidence whatsoever that these children have been harmed. Quite the contrary. He looked directly at Ruth. Mrs. McCord came to Texas with nothing. She had every reason to be bitter, angry, closed off. Instead, she chose compassion. She chose service. She chose love. That's not corruption. That's grace. Turning to the assembled crowd, he continued, I've also become aware that this complaint was motivated not by concern for children's welfare, but by personal grievance and financial interest. While the law doesn't prohibit complaints filed for improper reasons, it does allow me to consider motivation when rendering judgment. He picked up his gavel. The complaint is dismissed. The children will remain in the custody of Garrett and Ruth McCord, where they clearly belong. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through eternity. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the courtroom erupted. People were cheering, crying, embracing. The children rushed forward, wrapping themselves around Ruth and Garrett in a tangle of arms and tears and joy. We won, Wyatt kept saying. We actually won. Ruth couldn't speak, could only hold her children close and let the relief wash over her in waves. They'd fought, and they'd won. The family would stay together. Across the courtroom, she saw Evangeline sitting alone, her face pale and expressionless. Silas Drummond was already pushing through the crowd toward the exit, his plans for the McCord land shattered. Judge Webb had left the bench, his duty done. Dorothy Winters appeared beside them, her eyes bright with tears. Caroline would be so proud of all of you. Outside, the celebration continued. Dr. Boone shook Garrett's hand. Rosa hugged Ruth so tight she could barely breathe. Reverend McAllister offered a prayer of thanksgiving right there on the courthouse steps. Even people who'd been cold before came forward to offer congratulations, swayed, perhaps, by the judge's decisive ruling. But as the crowd began to thin, Ruth noticed a figure standing apart. Evangeline Shaw, still dressed in her fine clothes, watching the family with an expression Ruth couldn't quite read. Sadness? Regret? Envy? On impulse, Ruth walked over to her. Garrett called after her, but she waved him off. Mrs. Shaw? Mrs. McCord. Evangeline's voice was flat. I suppose you're here to gloat. No. I'm here to say I'm sorry. Sorry? Evangeline looked genuinely shocked. For what? That you're alone. That you're hurting. That you felt this was the only way to get what you needed. Ruth took a breath. I know what it's like to be desperate and afraid. I hope someday you find what you're looking for. I really do. She turned to go, then paused. There's someone out there for you, Evangeline. Someone who'll see past the bitterness to the lonely woman underneath. But you'll never find them if you keep using that bitterness as armor. Evangeline said nothing, but her eyes were wet as Ruth walked away. That night, the ranch erupted in celebration. Rosa brought food. The Hendersons came with a cake. Dr. Boone brought candy for the children. Even Marshal Tom Gifford stopped by to offer his congratulations, admitting he'd been watching Silas Drummond for years and was glad to see him lose. The house filled with laughter and music and the chaotic joy of a community coming together to celebrate justice done. The children ran wild, finally free of the fear that had haunted them for weeks. Hannah passed from lap to lap, soaking up attention like a flower in sunlight. As the evening wore on and guests began to leave, Ruth found herself on the porch with Dorothy Winters. The older woman had decided to stay in Red River Crossing for a few more weeks, wanting to spend time with her grandchildren. You did well today, Dorothy said, with Evangeline. That was generous. I couldn't let her suffer alone. I've been where she is. Caroline used to say that real strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting up and then helping others up, too. Dorothy smiled. You would have liked each other. Both of you see the world as something to be healed, not conquered. I wish I could have known her. You do know her. She lives in those children, in the home she built, in the love she planted that you're helping to grow. Dorothy patted Ruth's hand. You're not replacing her, child. You're honoring her. There's a difference. Later, after everyone had left and the children were finally exhaustedly asleep, Ruth and Garrett stood in the quiet house and simply held each other. No words needed. They'd survived the storm. The family was intact. Tomorrow they could begin to truly heal. I have something to tell you, Ruth said finally, pulling back to look at his face. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. We're going to have a baby. Garrett's eyes widened. Are you sure? Dr. Boone confirmed it yesterday. I was going to wait to tell you, but after everything we've been through, I don't want to wait for anything anymore. He pulled her close again, and she felt him shaking. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Caroline and I tried for years before Wyatt came. Thought we couldn't have children. Each one after that felt like a miracle. And now another miracle. You're the miracle, Ruth. You came into our broken family and made us whole. You fought when it would have been easier to run. You loved us when we were barely lovable. And now you're giving us new life in every possible way. They stood together in the lamplight, two people who'd been broken by loss and betrayal, who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, who'd fought for the right to love each other and won. Outside, the Texas night was vast and dark and full of stars. Inside, a family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would come and they'd face it together. Ruth thought about the girl she'd been in Philadelphia, pregnant and alone and terrified. About the woman who'd stepped off the train in Red River Crossing with $19 and no hope. About the journey that had led her here, to this moment, to this family, to this man who saw her not as damaged goods, but as treasure. She'd been told her whole life she wasn't enough. Too plain, too tall, too broken. But standing here in Garrett's arms, surrounded by the evidence of the family they'd built together, Ruth finally understood the truth. She wasn't too much or too little. She was exactly what they needed, and they were exactly what she needed too. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too, all of you. Everything you've been, everything you are, everything you'll become." And in that quiet moment, with 5 children sleeping peacefully and a 6th on the way, Ruth McCord finally believed she was home. 6 months passed like a dream Ruth was afraid to wake from. Winter surrendered to spring, and spring bloomed into the fierce heat of a Texas summer. The ranch transformed under the combined efforts of the family, each person contributing to the restoration of what grief had nearly destroyed. The house gleamed with fresh, white paint, the shutters a cheerful blue that Belle had chosen. The garden flourished, a hybrid of Caroline's original flower beds and Ruth's practical vegetable rows, existing side by side in peaceful harmony. The barn had a new roof. The corrals had been mended and expanded. 12 horses now occupied the stables, Garrett's training business growing as word spread about his skill with difficult animals. But the real transformation was in the people themselves. Wyatt had grown 3 inches, his boy's body stretching toward manhood. He worked alongside his father now as a true partner, his skill with horses nearly matching Garrett's own. The anger that had consumed him after Caroline's death had tempered into something more manageable, channeled into productive work and protective love for his siblings. Belle had discovered a passion for learning that Ruth encouraged with every book she could find. The girl devoured stories like others breathed air, already talking about becoming a teacher someday. She still helped with Hannah and the household, but now as a choice rather than an obligation. Lucas had become the family's unofficial horse whisperer, spending hours in the barn, talking to the animals in his quiet way. He'd grown confident, his silence transformed from grief-induced muteness to simple preference. When he spoke now, people listened, because Lucas never wasted words. Caleb's nightmares had vanished completely. He slept through the night now, waking with smiles instead of screams. He'd attached himself to Ruth with the fierce devotion only a 5-year-old could manage, following her around the house and chattering constantly about everything and nothing. And Hannah. Sweet Hannah had grown into a robust toddler, walking and talking and getting into everything with the fearless enthusiasm of a child who'd been loved back to life. She called Ruth Mama without hesitation, no memory of the desperate, dying infant she'd once been. Ruth herself had changed, too. Her body had grown round with pregnancy, her belly swelling with the new life growing inside her. But more than that, she'd grown into herself. The self-doubt that had plagued her entire life had quieted, replaced by a steady confidence earned through trial and victory. She was Ruth McCord, wife and mother, respected member of the Red River Crossing community. She belonged. On a Sunday morning in late July, the family prepared for church as usual. Ruth struggled with the buttons on her dress, her expanding waistline making even her loosest clothing tight. "Here, let me." Garrett appeared behind her, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he worked the stubborn fastening. When he finished, he rested his hands on her belly, feeling the baby kick. "Active this morning?" "Been kicking all night. I think we've got a fighter." "Takes after the mother." He kissed her neck softly. "You feeling all right? You don't have to go if you're tired." "I'm fine. Besides, Dorothy's visiting, and she wants to see all of us together." Caroline's mother had indeed stayed in Red River Crossing, initially for a few weeks, but extending her visit as the months passed. She'd taken a small house on the edge of town and become a fixture in her grandchildren's lives. The children adored her, and she doted on them with the fierce love of a woman who'd lost her only daughter, but gained a second chance at family. Church that morning was unusually full. Reverend McAllister had announced a special service to celebrate the community's growth and prosperity. As the McCord family filed into their usual pew, Ruth noticed the looks they received. But these were different from the suspicious stares and whispered judgments of 6 months ago. These were smiles, nods, greetings of genuine warmth. She'd earned her place here, one day at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one moment of showing up when it would have been easier to hide. The service was uplifting, full of hope and thanksgiving. But as Reverend McAllister began his closing prayer, a commotion at the back of the church drew everyone's attention. A rider had arrived, dusty and urgent, pushing through the doors without ceremony. "Marshal Gifford needs everyone outside. There's news." The congregation spilled out into the bright sunlight, buzzing with speculation. Marshal Tom Gifford stood on the church steps, his weathered face grave.
"Folks, I've just received word from the county seat. There's been a development concerning Silas Drummond and the land speculation case." Garrett tensed beside Ruth. Silas had disappeared after the custody hearing, his schemes for the McCord ranch thwarted. They'd heard rumors he'd moved on to other towns, other marks, but nothing concrete. Turns out Drummond was running more than just a land grab operation. He was involved in railroad fraud, forging documents to buy up property along proposed routes before the legitimate buyers could act. Federal marshals arrested him in Dallas 3 days ago. He's going to prison. A murmur ran through the crowd. Marshal Gifford held up his hand for silence. There's more. As part of his confession, Drummond admitted to coercing his sister into filing the complaint against the McCords. Said he pressured her, threatened to cut off her financial support if she didn't cooperate. All eyes turned to find Evangeline Shaw standing at the edge of the crowd. She looked smaller than Ruth remembered, diminished somehow. Her fine clothes seemed to hang on her frame as if she'd lost weight. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast. "Mrs. Shaw has asked to make a statement," Marshal Gifford said. Evangeline stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. When she spoke, her voice trembled but remained clear. "I owe the McCord family an apology. What I did was inexcusable. I let my brother manipulate me, let my own jealousy and bitterness cloud my judgment. I tried to destroy a good family because I couldn't stand to see them happy when I was miserable." She looked directly at Ruth. "You offered me kindness after the hearing, even though I didn't deserve it. You saw my loneliness and tried to help. I threw that back in your face. I'm ashamed of what I've done, and I understand if you can never forgive me." "It's not about deserving. It's about choosing to offer it anyway." Ruth extended her hand. After a moment's hesitation, Evangeline took it. And in that handshake, witnessed by the entire community of Red River Crossing, something shifted. The bitter woman who'd caused so much harm took her first step toward healing. And the woman who'd been victimized chose mercy over vengeance. As the crowd dispersed, people stopped to speak with Ruth and Garrett, offering congratulations and support. The story of Ruth's forgiveness would spread through the county, becoming part of the legend that was already growing around the McCord family. The mail-order bride who'd been rejected and redeemed. The cowboy who'd learned to love again. The children who'd survived loss and found hope. That afternoon, the family gathered at the ranch for Sunday dinner with Dorothy in attendance. Ruth had cooked a feast, her kitchen skills having improved dramatically over the months. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, and a blackberry pie made from berries the children had picked. They crowded around the table, adults and children mixed together in cheerful chaos. Hannah sat in her high chair, smearing food on her face with enthusiastic glee. Caleb chattered about a frog he'd found by the creek. Belle discussed a book she was reading. Lucas quietly carved extra meat from the chicken for the ranch dogs waiting outside. Wyatt and Garrett argued good-naturedly about the best way to break a particularly stubborn horse. And Ruth sat at the head of the table, her hand resting on her swollen belly, and felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was what she'd been searching for her entire life. Not perfection, but belonging. Not a life without struggle, but people to struggle alongside. After dinner, as the summer sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Garrett made an announcement. "Kids, Mama Ruth and I have been talking. We want to name the baby something special, something that honors the journey that brought us all together." 5 pairs of eyes turned toward them, curious and excited. Ruth took over. "If it's a boy, we'd like to name him James, after your father's middle name. And if it's a girl, we want to name her Hope, because that's what you all gave me when I thought I'd lost it forever." "Hope McCord," Belle said, testing the name. "I like it." "Me too," Lucas agreed. Wyatt nodded slowly. Mama Caroline would approve. She always said hope was the strongest thing a person could hold on to. As the children debated potential nicknames and discussed whether they'd prefer a brother or sister, Dorothy pulled Ruth aside. "You've done something remarkable here, you know. I've just loved them, that's all. That's everything." Dorothy's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "When Caroline died, I thought this family was finished. Thought Garrett would drown in his grief and the children would be lost. But you came along and refused to let that happen. I almost didn't stay. That first night, when Hannah was so sick, I was terrified. Thought I'd made a terrible mistake coming here. But you stayed anyway. That's what makes you remarkable. Not that you were never afraid, but that you were brave enough to stay afraid and do it anyway." Ruth looked out over the ranch, at the house she'd helped restore, at the children playing in the yard, at Garrett watching his family with quiet contentment. "I spent so many years thinking I wasn't enough. Too plain, too tall, too broken. Every rejection confirmed what I already believed about myself. And now? Now I know I was just waiting for the right place, the right people. I wasn't not enough. I was exactly enough for this family, in this place, at this time." As twilight deepened into night, the family gathered on the porch for their evening ritual. They'd done this every night since Ruth arrived, this coming together as day surrendered to darkness. It had started as a way to check on each other, to make sure everyone was all right. But it had evolved into something more precious, a daily reminder that they were a family, by choice and by love. Garrett sat in his chair with Hannah drowsing in his lap. The older children sprawled on the porch floor or leaned against railings. Dorothy occupied the rocking chair that had once been Caroline's, and Ruth stood at the railing, looking out over the land that had become home. "Tell us a story, Mama Ruth," Caleb requested, as he often did. "What kind of story?" "A true one, about when you first came here." Ruth smiled, remembering. Once upon a time, there was a woman who thought she wasn't good enough for anyone. She'd been rejected and hurt so many times that she'd almost given up hoping for anything better. The children settled in, even though they'd heard variations of this story before. It had become their origin myth, the tale of how their fractured family had been made whole. Then one day, she saw an advertisement. A man in Texas needed someone to care for his 5 children. She had $19 to her name and nowhere else to go. So she got on a train and traveled to a place she'd never been, to meet people she'd never known. "And she saved me," Hannah mumbled sleepily. "She saved all of us," Wyatt corrected gently. "The woman was terrified," Ruth continued. "She thought she'd fail, thought she'd disappoint everyone, thought she'd prove all those voices right that said she wasn't enough. But something strange happened. The more she showed up, the more she tried, the more she realized those voices were wrong. She turned to face her family, all of them watching her in the lamplight. She learned that being enough wasn't about being perfect or beautiful or refined. It was about showing up every day and doing the work of love, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. "And then she married Papa and became our real Mama," Belle said. "And then there was a terrible fight with mean people who wanted to take us away," Caleb added. "But we won because we told the truth," Lucas finished. Ruth nodded. "We won because we stood together, because we refused to let anyone define our family except us, and because we chose love over fear, hope over despair, forgiveness over bitterness." Garrett looked at her across the porch, his gray eyes full of emotions he'd learned to express. "Best decision I ever made was sending that advertisement. Second best was recognizing a miracle when it stepped off the train." "I'm the one who got the miracle," Ruth said softly. "No," Wyatt stood up, suddenly serious in the way young men get when expressing deep truths. "We all got miracles. Papa got a wife who makes him laugh again." She thought about Evangeline Shaw, starting her own journey toward healing. About Silas Drummond facing justice for his crimes. About Dorothy Winters finding joy again after losing her daughter. About Dr. Boone and Rosa and Reverend McAllister, and all the ordinary people who'd formed a community around their family. But most of all, she thought about the 5 children who'd become hers not through biology, but through choice, who'd taken a stranger and made her family, who'd taught her that love wasn't about perfection, but persistence, not about never falling, but always getting back up. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too. Every part of you. Every piece of your past that made you who you are. Every scar that taught you to survive. Every fear you faced and conquered. You're beautiful, Ruth. Not despite everything you've been through, but because of it." She fell asleep in his arms, safe and loved, and finally, home. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning, when the air smelled of wood smoke and changing seasons, Ruth went into labor. Dr. Boone was summoned. Dorothy took charge of the household. Garrett paced like a caged animal, useless in the face of the one thing he couldn't fix or control. The children waited anxiously, Belle keeping the little ones occupied while Wyatt and Lucas tried to distract their father. Hours passed, slow and anxious. Then faster, more intense, and finally, as the sun set in a blaze of autumn glory, a baby's cry rang through the house. Dr. Boone emerged from the bedroom, smiling. "You have a daughter. Mother and baby are both healthy." Garrett rushed inside to find Ruth propped up in bed, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined chin. "Hope," Ruth said, looking up at her husband with tears streaming down her face. "Our hope." One by one, the children were allowed in to meet their new sister. They crowded around the bed, marveling at tiny fingers and perfect features. Hannah insisted on climbing up to see better, patting the baby's head with surprising gentleness. "My baby sister," she announced proprietarily. As the family settled in for the evening, Ruth looked around at the faces she loved. At Garrett, who'd given her a second chance at love. At Wyatt, who'd learned to trust again. At Belle, finding her voice and her dreams. At Lucas, whose silence had become strength. At Caleb, no longer afraid. At Hannah, thriving and loved. At Dorothy, who'd welcomed her as a daughter. And at Hope, tiny and new and full of possibility. This was her family. Not perfect, but perfect for her. Built not on blood alone, but on choice and commitment, and the daily decision to show up and love each other through everything life threw at them. Outside, the Texas sky darkened to deep blue, stars beginning to emerge like diamonds scattered across velvet. Inside the McCord Ranch, a family gathered around new life, around hope made flesh, around the proof that broken things could be mended, and lost people could be found, and second chances were real. Ruth McCord, who'd once believed she wasn't worthy of any man's love, finally understood the truth. She hadn't been unworthy. She'd simply been waiting for the right family to choose her back. To see her not as too much or too little, but as exactly enough. And in that moment, holding her newborn daughter, while surrounded by the children who'd become hers and the man who'd made her his wife, Ruth knew something profound and true. She was home. She was loved. She was chosen. And she was enough. She had always been enough. The story of Ruth McCord would be told in Red River Crossing for generations. The mail-order bride who'd been rejected but came to Texas anyway, who'd saved a dying baby and a broken family, who'd fought in court and won with truth and grace, who'd forgiven her enemy and changed a community's heart. But more than that, she'd proven something that hurting people everywhere needed to hear, that your past doesn't define your future, that being broken doesn't make you worthless, that love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the family you choose is every bit as real as the family you're born into. As the lamp was extinguished and the house settled into sleep, Ruth held her daughter close and whispered the truth that had taken her 28 years to learn. You are enough, little Hope, just as you are, and you always will be. Outside, the wind carried that whisper across the prairie, across the generations, across all the miles and years, to every person who'd ever felt unworthy or unloved or alone. You are enough. You have always been enough. You will always be enough. And somewhere in the great mystery beyond, Caroline McCord smiled. The end.